The focus of our second panel discussion this morning is the role of supervision in developing effective leaders. We have three panelists, as before. First, I want to introduce to you Bishop Cynthia Harvey, Episcopal leader of the Louisiana Episcopal area. She is a graduate of the University of Texas, Austin, and also Perkins School of Theology. She served the Foundry United Methodist Church in Houston and also Memorial Drive United Methodist Church in Houston. After that, she served on the Texas Annual Conference staff as the Director of Missional Excellence. And she's also served our denomination as the Deputy General Secretary for the United Methodist Committee on Relief, a position from which she was elected into the episcopacy in 2012 from the South Central jurisdiction. Please welcome Bishop Cynthia Harvey. Gail Ford Smith noted that historically we've had a pipeline that fed leadership into the church, and among our two panelists, they self-identified as not of that pipeline, and Bishop Harvey is one of those. Candace Lansberry is the other one. Candace now serves as the District Superintendent of the North District of the Desert Southwest Annual Conference. She's a graduate of Brigham Young University and of the Claremont School of Theology. She acquired her Doctor of Ministry degree from Drew and has planted two churches, the Daybreak Church in Las Vegas and the Song of Life Church in the Phoenix area. Candace is now serving in her 7th year as the superintendent for the North District on the cabinet of the Desert Southwest Annual Conference, and I invite you to welcome Candace. Our third panelist is Tom Choi, serving as the district superintendent of the Hawaii District and California Pacific Annual Conference. Tough work, but somebody's got to do it. Tom is a graduate of the Pomona College and of Yale Divinity School. He acquired his Doctor of Ministry degree from Wesley Seminary. Tom established the Ascension Ministry for second generation Korean American, and is also, how would you describe it, Tom?
Pastor? I don't know.
No. So anyway, it was a second generation. It was the first of its kind ministry in the California Pacific Annual Conference at the Westwood United Methodist Church, and then served at Kailua United Methodist Church in Hawaii. And from there was appointed onto the cabinet of the California Pacific Annual Conference. Tom and Candace have also both served on the Board of Ordained Ministry for their respective conferences. So please welcome Tom as our panelist. Again, Val Hastings will be the moderator for this panelist, and I invite the crew to please post the picture of the new room, if you would, please. I selected this image as the first image for this conversation on supervision and the role it plays in developing effective leaders, because those of you who've visited the new room know that in that octagonal clerestory window that's pictured there in the top of the picture, you can't see it from this angle of the new room, but if you're standing in the pulpit and look up into it, you see a window through which John Wesley would sit unnoticed, except by the preacher probably, and take notes on early Methodist preachers' work in the pulpit and give them direct feedback to help them improve their preaching. I love that image for supervision, because it was truly a pastoral act of helping them develop their skills. Literally watching over one another in love. So with that as our entree into the conversation, I now invite our panelists and Val to lead us in this conversation, and you have some directions about how they can participate.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Myron. Well, hello again. It's good to be with you for our second panel discussion. And I'm really grateful for the three panelists that are here. You know, there are two kinds of people in the world. There are those that kind of ease their way into the pool, the swimming pool. They kind of put a big toe in, and then about 30 minutes later, they put their ankle in. And then 3 hours later, the knee. This is not that group. They are the deep end swimmers. They go to the deepest end and jump right in. And that's how we're going to do the panel today. In just a couple moments, we are just going to jump right into the conversation. We are going to do our best to engage you as quickly as possible. And so I'm looking forward to what shows up in our time together.
We are too.
They are too. You should know that we prayed beforehand. So we are really ready for our time together. There are 3x5 cards at the table. And what we would like for you to do is to write down your questions about the role of supervision in the developing effectiveness of leaders. Your questions, and I think there'll be some people floating around. We want to collect these questions. I just think it's great to have the questions to begin with. Our hope is that we can use this to guide some of our discussion later today. You will have a chance to ask questions of the group that's in the front. There are microphones. There are 2 of them on the floor. And when I give direction for you to ask questions, if you would then go to one of those microphones so that we can hear you. So having said all of that, we're ready to begin. And the first question for our panelists is this. Talk to us about the role of supervision from A to Z, from the calling at the beginning of candidacy all the way through and including retirement.
And the 2 panelists said that I should go first, so thank you, I think. I didn't have John Wesley reviewing my sermon, but I did have John Holbert sitting in his office watching videotapes of every sermon you preached in his class, and that was pretty terrifying. So maybe not as much as John Wesley, but certainly I had that experience. As we have talked among ourselves and in our own experiences, the whole process really begins when Junior or Jane walks into a pastor's office and says, I think I'm feeling a call to ministry. That used to be the way it was. Gail Ford Smith alluded to this earlier. Today, our pastors are having to look for where those people are. If you haven't read The Rare Find, you need to, because that is looking for people that are uniquely that you see a spark or a stirring for ministry. So it really begins in a local congregation. And a local congregation is likely never to say no to Junior or Jane. We love them, we raised them, we know their grandfather, all of those sorts of things. So it really becomes important as the pastor then hands folks off to the DCOM. And I think that's where it becomes pretty essential in the process as we evaluate whether these people that are candidates for ministry, they've gone through the charge conference and they show up at the doorstep of the DCOM. The DCOM's got to have enough chutzpah to yay or nay. And I remember serving with my friend Morris Mathis, and I think Morris on the DCOM, we were always the ones that got to have the prayer time with the person that didn't come back in the room. I used to call that drawing the short straw. I'm now in this role beginning to think that was maybe not drawing the short straw, because that was the most grace-filled thing to do. So that supervision really begins, I think, in earnest at that point. So training our DCOMs to really discern with the candidate where they are and where they're going. Because once they get into the RIM process, you're way down the road at that point. Our RIM process in Louisiana is 3 years. It's pretty rigorous. Over the 3-year period of time, our interview team meets with these RIM folk for twice a year for the 3-year process. They hear 6 sermons from these people, sometimes more. So that is, again, part of the supervisory process is, are you willing to, even in the midst of that 3 years, to have those hard conversations? So that, to me, is the next sort of big step. And We have, in fact, in a 2-year time frame, asked someone to no longer follow the process in a grace-filled way. Then you've got your folks, we tend to ordain people and then never do anything with them again. So what are we going to do? I think that supervisory process, again, once they're in and serving a church, what are some of those key points, benchmarks, expectations that we have, all the way to retirement? Sometimes our pastors retire and they think that they've got free reign now to do whatever they want to do and say whatever they want to say. So there's some supervision then, even with some of our retired pastors. I think that to be true. So those are kind of the milestone points. And I want to tell you that the three of us are no experts at this. We realize that there are people in this room that are way more expert at some of this than we are. So we're fellow journeyers with you, but we felt that those were sort of the benchmark points in the supervisory process for us as we journey with these folks who are in the discernment process all the way to the retirement.
Thank you.
I'd like to add
Hold the microphones a little closer
Okay.
just to a question.
All right,
There you
are we good? I've discovered in this role that there is a huge lack of awareness about the process among not only our laity, but our clergy. And so part of what we do as superintendents, I think, is to help educate our pastors. Often I will get a call from a pastor almost in panic. Now that's probably a little bit of an exaggeration, but I have somebody who's interested in ministry. What do I do? And so, GBHEM has some wonderful resources. There are DVDs and there are websites. There are all sorts of things that you can point people to. But Christian is minister. How many of you remember that thing? That's no longer something that we do. That has changed recently. And so I get a lot of questions just at that level. When I served as chair of BOM many, many moons ago, it was after the 1996 discipline came out and all, but what broke loose because nobody had a clue of what it meant to go into ministry. And so I wrote a monthly column for our conference newsletter called Dear BOM. And it was like fictional questions or hypothetical questions from candidates or clergy who didn't know how the process went. And so we took them from exploring candidacy to declare candidacy to certify candidacy and then to the board. So part of what we need to do is educate and make people aware of what the process is so that when those steps come, they're prepared for what's going to come next. And so I think that's also part of what we do as supervisors.
Sure, and I think the role of the district superintendent from the very beginning is vital. And one of the things that I would advise and is very important is for the superintendents to understand our OCAS system. I think consistently what I have heard from our board and other boards is that the roadblock, or firewall if you will, is the district superintendent not knowing how to get into the OCAS system to be able to approve mentors and so forth. So I guess if you haven't been to the UM Cares training today, please, you're not planning to go, maybe plan to go. I think as a former registrar of the Board of Ordained Ministry, one of the most disheartening things that I see or saw was when there's a reference turned in by a district superintendent that says, I do not know this candidate, all right? That's really a problem because as a superintendent, you're supposed to be the one who knows this person and brought them into the system in the first place. So I think that's very important. And I think the superintendent's recommendation or reference is very important for the board's consideration. And in CalPAC, we just don't say, do you think this person is ready for ordained ministry? Not just yes or no, but we also say, how willing are you to have this person as your pastor? And we have four choices: delighted, willing, uncertain, and prefer not. And I think sometimes, depending on who's the candidate and who the reference is, when they say willing, you have to say, okay, is that being polite, or is that just, or are there reasons for that? So I think getting varied information like that and nuanced information is helpful, and the DS reference is extremely important.
And I find particularly when it comes to deacons, that's most often when the DS doesn't know anything about the deacon. And so I just raise that up because I think it's important that that you know that they either don't know the person, don't know what they've done, all the way even to the credentialing process, that they're not familiar with who the deacon is. And I think that that's also a critical missing piece in this process. I'll just share that one of the things that happened this time is when the intersection of supervision and the work of the Board of Ordained Ministry, where are those points of intersection? And while that's a slippery slope for a lot of us, I find that that's incredibly important. I will tell this anecdotal story with no names, but halfway through the appointive process this year, I stepped out of the room and I called one of our Board of Ordained Ministry persons and said, so I've got an associate pastor for you. And so when I said the name, they said, oh, no, Bishop, I can't, I don't know, I'm not sure that would be wise in this situation. Like, you credentialed them. Would you be willing for them to be your associate pastor, your mother's pastor? I think that that's a real important intersection where these two things become incredibly critical.
So let's use that as a segue then into that slippery slope that you talked about, the intersection with the Board of Ordained Ministry with supervision. Say some more about that.
I'm going to add that just before that the DS's participation in the district committees is very important. Let me just take a poll, a little hand straw poll. How many of you in your settings, your district superintendent participates in the district committee on ministry, especially the interview process? Raise your hand. And how many of your superintendents do not? Okay, that's pretty good. I think it's really important for that helps with that reference, like I don't know the candidate. I mean, it really is helpful, especially the district committee level, for the district committee, the DS to be an intimate part of that particular process.
In our case, the intersection also comes, we do in-parish visits. How many of you do in-parish visits? Okay. Every year that the person is in residency, a committee meets with the pastor and the SPR, separate meetings, and with the superintendent. So in each of those three experiences, we share with one another, without going into great detail, where some of our concerns might be in the supervision that we've already experienced or what we foresee as problematic. And that's busting through that firewall that we keep talking about, but that's also very different. That's a very collaborative piece of work where we meet twice a year with the Board of Ordained Ministry, and they bring all of those that are in process. And that's a chance for the cabinet to say, I might have an issue here. There may be a problem here. Are these people appointable? All of those kinds of questions we flesh out in our two sometimes very hard conversations that we have with one another twice a year. Again, a slippery slope when you talk about credentialing and supervising and appointing. But for us, it's working so far, and really a collaborative piece of work, because at the end, what we all want is effective pastors. So how we get there, we may be skirting around some places maybe we shouldn't go, but thus far, it's really helpful that we look at people every year while they're in process and try to raise up any red flags that are starting to rear their ugly heads so that we don't get to year 3, because I said to the Board of Ordained Ministry when I got there, it hasn't been that long since I sat in an ordination service when my bishop was about to lay hands on someone, and I wanted to raise my hand and said, I object, don't do it, don't do it. I said, don't make me ordain somebody that you do not think is ready. And so we have that. I think we've created that mutual piece of work, that collaboration between the two of us, that what we want at the end of the day is an effective pastor.
Yeah, I think we have fitness for ministry at the DCOM level, and we have readiness for ministry at the provisional level, and the effectiveness level for ordination, I think, is where that conversation does need to happen, because we as supervisors are the ones who are watching them in ministry. And if you are gauging as boards effectiveness in ministry, there does need to be some dialogue, I believe, in that effectiveness. And I do think that for the most part we talk through the barriers that we see and or the parameters and the boundaries that need to be in place in order for there to be a good balance, a checks and balance system. But at that stage in ministry, it's pretty hard to be objective in effectiveness. It takes subjectivity because they are in ministry with us. And so that, at that point, I think the conversation, the dialogue needs to be something like what Bishop Harvey has going on in their annual conference. Ours more takes place between the bishop and the board chair. That tends to be our dialogue stream in the Desert Southwest. But we receive an email after the interview from our board chair, so all of the cabinet gets here are the people who passed, and here are some, if there are any concerns, we find out about them. That's especially true at the provisional level so that we can walk with them through those things. So I think conversation's gotten better in our annual conference as well.
So in just a moment, I want to open it up for some questions, but I just want to press you just a little bit further. I think we've gotten to this, but if you were to name the elephants in the room at this intersection, put names to the elephants.
It's interesting. I've been on both sides of this elephant now.
Okay.
And so I will share
That's
it.
good.
I think one thing is if the board continues someone or does not approve them, and then a cabinet appoints them as a local pastor, right? And or the district superintendent says, this candidate has serious issues, I would not ordain them, and boom, approves them. I think those are, it's almost the same elephant, but the bottom line is if one or the other of us thinks the candidate isn't ready to be in ministry, they aren't ready to be in ministry. And I think that's a dialogue, or that's an elephant that we need to address.
I would agree that's our elephant, maybe a different color. But that is certainly the elephant that we deal with. And this issue of we discontinue them as to be an elder, but, we're just going to make you a local pastor. And our cabinet now knows, I always say, to Myrtle on the front row pulpit side, a pastor is a pastor is a pastor. She doesn't care whether they're local pastors, doctors, or credentialed or not. They just want a pastor. So if they've got issues in pastoring, they've got issues in pastoring. Now, there are some situations where it makes sense for them to be a local pastor if it has to do with some other issues. But I really hold firm that you just don't move them to something else. If they don't have the capacity to pastor, they don't have the capacity to pastor.
Yeah, and I would add that this whole talk about firewall is actually pretty serious, because I think it creates this almost, I would say, demilitarized zone in some ways, because it really is adversarial. And I like Myron's The Fence with a Gate, that there are times when we really do need to be separate, and but there are a lot of times when we should be collaborating, talking, meeting, saying, yeah, what are the expectations from each side for candidates? What are things that we can do? And just the very act of relating and being in relationship improves things tremendously.
Good, thank you. Let's open it to a question or two, and if you go to the microphone, a question of our panel.
We are so articulate.
There you go.
Aren't we?
Okay, all right. So first of all, thank you for your cards. Here's one. Should we be asking, will this person be an effective minister shouldn't we be asking, will this pastor be an effective minister for my children and grandchildren's church 25 to 40 years from now, instead of, will this person be an effective pastor for me right now? Parentheses, I am 63 years old.
I would say absolutely. I think the other question is this pastor able to serve in a multicultural setting? I really think that that's also something we've got to look in the future. Can they serve in a multicultural setting?
Yeah.
And can they be the pastor?
Well, as long as we're talking about multicultural, I think it's going to be very important to have cultural competency training everywhere, because our denomination looks one way. If you look at our room, it looks one way, and the rest of our population is looking increasingly different, and so it's important to do that. I just want to throw in just a little thing about maybe those groups that have come to the United States fairly recently, maybe speaking the language, that sometimes when they come and they don't quite understand some of the board's questions, I think for speaking from my own culture, ancestral culture, for Korean Americans, for Korean pastors, especially those who have come from Korea, they tend to have difficulty in the areas of confidentiality and mandatory reporting and understanding that, and that's really often what I experience trips them up. And so it's important that boards be diverse, that they might have someone on their board, or maybe somebody they can trust and can turn to that might be bilingual, that can help. We have a situation where we had that with the mandatory reporting situation, and there was a member of the board who was Korean American who was able to talk to the candidate and kind of explain it, and then also our district superintendent for that candidate was also able to meet with that candidate and explain some of these issues. So that kind of helps, and that particular superintendent is very culturally competent. I think in general, for like bishops and superintendents, in terms of supervising for Korean pastors, which is my best experience, is that you don't necessarily go for the Korean caucus officers because they may be ceremonially put into positions, but you need to find who are the people who are the opinion leaders in the Korean community, or maybe a different community, and then gather those people and just have conversation. I know that Bishop Carcano, when she came in, she very self-consciously brought together those opinion leaders, and the relationship between the Korean caucus and the cabinet and the annual conference has really improved. And I always make sure that I try to meet with my Korean pastors on a regular basis. We go to lunch and we just talk, because sometimes they consider me Korean and sometimes they don't. So it's important to develop that relationship.
I understand that.
As far as the grandchildren, and I think it's contextual, so I don't think we can say everybody that we interview should be able to serve every church from now into infinity. For instance, in Arizona and Southern Nevada, we have a lot of retirement communities, and maybe some of you are in that kind of context. So we might get a candidate for ministry who's second or third or fourth career, but very competent, and there would be plenty of places for them to serve in our annual conference and serve effectively. So I do think that we need to be careful that we don't have blanket expectations that we expect everybody to meet. Because otherwise we're going to lose out on some really good pastors. So I would just add that.
Great. And we have a question?
Following up on that, let's say you have a conference that doesn't have enough churches or even a church for a certain group. How does the board deal with credentialing a person, for instance, a Korean pastor who comes to Northwest Texas? We have no full-time Korean churches, and we find ourselves feeling socially and morally obligated sometimes to credential, but in reality, with guaranteed appointment and guaranteed salary, we find ourselves in struggle. Would you speak to that issue, not just language, but that's one of the issues?
That's that tyranny of the fair we heard about, right? The first day. We all want to be fair. We have that problem. We have some we have some language ministry pastors, and we don't have those congregations in our context. And so hopefully your annual conferences or your jurisdictions have some permeable boundaries so that conversations can start happening around. We have a great candidate for ministry. We really have no place for them. And start those conversations and see if there are conferences in your jurisdiction who would be able to utilize them. That would be one way to look at that.
Agree. I would say to you, in the South Central jurisdiction, your college of bishops have those kinds of conversations.
Good. Here's a question, and by the way, come to the microphone if you have other questions. Given the consolidation of districts and conferences across the country, what are the practical implications of effectiveness of the Episcopals as bishops, superintendents for supervision and their responsibilities? What are the practical implications of that?
I wish Bishop Jones was here because he'd tell you the story of it takes him longer to get from Wichita to the corner of Nebraska than it does Galveston, Texas from Wichita because it's a huge area. I met somebody yesterday that's the district superintendent for Montana. My friend here drives 4 hours from one place to another in her district. I mean, I think one of the I'm watching because as you reduce districts, some of my superintendents in the last redistricting went from 40 or so churches to almost, some have over 100, and it's virtually impossible to supervise that. It's virtually impossible for a bishop to supervise that many people. So you have to look at, where is the impact that you can make that'll have the greatest trajectory of change, if you will, because I've told my superintendents, we don't need you to focus on 100 churches. I need you to focus on the 20 that are going to really make a difference. Which 20 are going to impact the trajectory of decline. But the unfortunate part and the reality is that little church down here with 10 people sucks the life out of you as a superintendent and as a bishop. So I think that's an ongoing challenge for us. And I'm praying that we don't continue to just make financial decisions in that regard, but that we make strategic decisions about how to redistrict and how to, if we're going to reduce Episcopal areas, how do we do that in a way that you can actually supervise those people that you're called to supervise?
Right. Well, coming from the Hawaii District, which includes 4 Hawaiian Islands, Guam, and Saipan, which makes us point to point the largest district in the connection geographically, we've had to learn how to kind of deal with distance issues for a long time, and part of it is solved by video conferencing, which is not as good. I actually think that phones are better than video conferencing because sometimes the technical issues just go on and on. Also, I think consolidation, what I have been doing with candidates in the candidacy stage, I am a regular participant in the group mentoring that we have in our district. So I have like session 3, I think, and I come and I share my call to ministry and then I talk about areas of the process and explain the appointed process and do things like that. And I think that's a good way for me to meet several candidates at once. And I have also been meeting a group of provisional candidates and also full connection candidates in a group together to kind of work through the process. So consolidation in that way and meeting in groups is how I'm addressing that.
Yeah, we haven't had to consolidate districts because our districts are pretty big geographically anyway, and so and we're probably, I think, one of the very smallest conferences, and so we have some different issues. But one of the ways that I've addressed distance with effectiveness and how does one supervise and help pastors be more effective is I have chosen a theme per year for sort of teaching and training. I've been so blessed to be the recipient of church planting training and a lot of really great input. And what I discovered when I came on the district is a lot of pastors have not had any of that training. And so part of the giftedness I think that I can bring is to connect that learning with a lot of people. And so we have a theme every year. District training is in January or February, and it's around a theme, and so I've brought people in and we've talked about evangelism. So for a whole year, everything we did was evangelism. So we meet in clusters as clergy, we read books, we have discussions, we share best practices. So those happen throughout the district in clusters. We've talked about worship design, we've talked about storytelling, about leadership development, spiritual formation. You know, because as I've traveled around and see the issues that are the church, I say, okay, this is enough of an issue across the district where this needs to be our area of focus for the next year. And so that I think has helped. The church conferences then, the conversations we have there cover the same theme. And so what we learn at district training, we sort of put into, and here's what we expect to see when we come and visit you, or we have conversations with you and your pastor and your churches. How's the progress going? How are things going? How can we help? How can we be of resource? So that's sort of by changing the focus of I need to empower effectiveness church by church by church by church on a one-on-one basis, we've sort of made it, here's the theme of the year. Here are resources that are available. Here are different conversations and different ways of engaging with that particular point of excellence, if you will. And we try to keep that consistent throughout the year. So that's one way we've dealt with. We can no longer be face-to-face, probably one-on-one as often as we would need to really affect change.
So let's continue this topic. I mean, it sounds like you need to be much more creative with how you supervise. And this actually moves us into the best practices area. For example, one question is, what are the most helpful evaluative tools? What are some of those other creative best practices that you'd say, hey, this works or is working for us?
Well, the thing I think that I was most excited about was we have no seminary in Hawaii, and Jeffrey Kwan, who was then, he's now the president of CST, but he was then the dean of Drew Seminary, came and said, we want to help you because we know that Hawaii has no theological education opportunities locally, and we talked about some things that we could do, but then we also talked about, you know, when I was in seminary, I did an internship in Hawaii, and I've got a church. They really are a part-time appointment, but they do have a parsonage, they do have a vehicle. Maybe we could have that person be an intern. And so he invited me to come to Drew. It was the weekend of the worst snowstorm in 40 years in the Northeast in New Jersey. And so I met with people with the power off, and I said, how'd you like to come to Hawaii, you know, for a year? And I got a lot of takers, I tell you. And we settled in on a really great candidate, and this person was graduating. So in this case, what we did was we transferred his candidacy to our annual conference, and then he served for us. And then he made the decision to go through the provisional process with our annual conference, and now he's one of our brightest young pastors. And so now, not every place is Hawaii, I understand, but you know, this year we are taking an intern from Drew, and that person is in one of the nether regions of our annual conference, and she is fully bilingual in English and Spanish. She just wants to serve, and it just is so grateful for this opportunity, and is up there, and so far is doing some great work. So that's one way in which we've sort of said, okay, you know, this is somebody who's going to be cared for by the Board of Ordinating Ministry. This is some way in which we can connect the seminary, and one way in which the cabinet can, you know, if you will, because of guaranteed appointment or security appointment and so forth, we can sort of test drive a person. And also, I do know that our board said that when that West Kauai candidate came through, said, boy, it was so good to have a body of work to look at and say, yeah, we can really look at this candidate very carefully and seriously. So that's one thing that I think that has been really successful.
How about a real practical question around best practices? What book would you recommend?
For supervision,
For supervision, yeah.
Lencioni's The Advantage would be the top of my list for any pastor, any cabinet because it gives you a playbook to work from.
One of the books that's been really helpful for my pastors is Lencioni's book, Death by Meeting.
Say that again?
Death by Meeting. You all lead meetings more often than just about anything, and most of them are pretty deadly. And so we had that conversation because it was just so practical. And the best thing about discussing books or recommending books and then actually not just recommending them but discussing them afterwards is, how many of you ever agree totally with everything you read in any one book, right? You don't. So some great conversations come out of where we disagree with what someone said or where, oh, I had never thought of it that way, So a best practice for us really has been suggesting books, and I ask people for great books that they've read. This year our theme is spiritual formation, because I was discovering that a lot of our pastors just were not taking the time to feed their spirit, and Fred mentioned that in the earlier panel. And so we started our district training with that. We actually did an online Bible study around a book study, and I've asked our pastors to read over the summer Richard Rohr's book, Falling Upward, and which is about spirituality, not only in yourself, but what you're seeing in the congregation, to hopefully help our pastors better engage their people from a spiritual formation perspective. And so, I think that you have to take what are the issues coming up consistently in your annual conference and what might be helpful.
I was going to say the Book of Discipline, actually, selected parts are really good, and some are not. But actually, it's really true. When it comes to especially supervision, knowing the discipline is extremely important. But, Val, I wanted to ask you, stepping away from your role as moderator, you're the, from the coaching perspective, what would you say is the best practice?
So I think the best practice is to not lead alone. Is to connect, to intentionally connect with someone else, to have another person, whether it is a coach or it is a group of clergy, that you can be real with and candid, that they're interested in you 120%. They want to see you succeed. I think too many of us are serving alone.
Just to piggyback on that, one of the things I'm finding in this first 2 years is particularly high-profile churches and high-profile pastors that find themselves underwater really quickly, but yet they're high-profile and pastors in high-profile churches, and asking for help for all pastors is difficult, but particularly when you get into these kinds of churches. So we have formed accountability groups. Actually, the first test group starts meeting next month, of a group of those pastors in those high-profile churches, high-profile pastors, and it's an accountability group so that if you are underwater, before you drown, you can turn to a brother or a sister and say, I'm drowning, I need help. And the group that we have started with was very open to being that for one another, because it's a lonely place all the time in ministry. But I find particularly in those places where you're in the fishbowl all the
absolutely.
time.
And I applaud what you're doing. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to just add, I'm not sure if it qualifies as a best practice, but I think it's one of the most important practices is for DSs, especially, and boards of ordained ministry, to really keep a running file, a written file of all your candidates. Because, in cabinet, we come with this ineffective pastor, let's see the file. Oh, the SPRC says everything is wonderful, and the past 5 churches, and there's nothing with, but they call and they say they have problems. I says, well, you need to write it, tell them, write it down, otherwise we can't do anything. And so keeping the file, keeping the record is really, I think, an underrated practice.
Yes.
Absolutely. We do have a question.
Actually, it's not a question, but it's in pursuit of the invitation earlier to be conversational about it. And it's related to the comment you made, Val, about being a best practice with being connected and not leading alone. I shared this information with the affinity group of Episcopal leaders and DSs yesterday, but the Pastoral Excellence Network has done some very good field research. It's a Lilly grant funded effort to put active clergy in connection with one another in what they call communities of practice. And it's determined by geographic proximate congregational locations. So the pastors are in a particular geographic area, regardless of the church size or that pastor's ethnicity or the congregation's ethnicity. If they're in a particular region, then they're grouped together for the sake of, first of all, building a community of support for one another and knowledge of each other's work and lives, and then a community of practice that they work with each other in reaching out to the community. The focus of it is, what are you doing to serve the world around you? But because it leads with that focus, it takes that concern about, that self-consciousness about how am I performing, away from it. But it has the reverse effect of actually building a community of trust, because they're not focusing on how good they're doing this. They're focusing on, what are we doing together to serve the world around us? And there's a lot of evidence that it's also providing a healthier context for peer supervision and peer accountability, and a context in which, when it's happening among Methodists, when the district superintendent or other denominations, regional supervisors, have a group of folks to talk to about how they're playing together, how they're working together. And it's not just this one-on-one, what the supervisor observes about the individual pastor, but rather what the supervisor sees is happening in that group mix. And it's a healthier climate for practicing supervision. You can say, do you see what I see? There's a lot of promise here. How do we nurture that promise? Or, do you see what I see? Maybe there's a problem here that we could attend to and help this person.
Well, that's great. I would just add one PS to that, and I think those geographical groups are spot on, but I will tell you from my experience, people hire me because I don't live next door. Mm-hmm. And the only time I've been fired, only once, was when we bumped into each other, and he said, I'm sorry, it's too small of a world. We can't work together anymore. So we need to offer both of those safe places for people. So, any other comments, best practices?
I also think there's something to be said about clarity of expectation. Mm-hmm. I think, in my experience, both in my secular life and in my ministry life, I was most effective when I was clear, like crystal clear about what the expectation was of my work. And I wonder if we looked at that throughout our ministry and in our work as boards of ordained ministry and as cabinets. Are we crystal clear with the expectations? I know that Gail had a kind of a laundry list that they use in Texas, and I was under that laundry list of expectation at one time in my life. But are we being clear about what we want from our pastors? In Louisiana, we know that we expect our pastors to lead people to an abundant life in Christ, to engage in the community, to learn, live, tell the gospel story, to reach out and draw in people from all walks of life. And you're going to do that with integrity, accountability, an unrelenting love for all people, courage and risk, holding nothing sacred but the mission. That's the expectation. An effective pastor has to live in and out of that vision, mission, and those core values. How now we're moving to how do we continue to assess that? When the district superintendent meets with the pastor each year, we use that as our guide. When I meet with the superintendents each year, I use that as my guide. But some of our younger folk are wanting feedback much faster than once a year. So we've got to also be sensitive to the fact that we've got to respond real time in some cases. So, that clarity of expectations. In my own life, I have been most effective when I knew what I was supposed to do.
Thank you. Anyone else?
When, DSs get a lot of really strange letters. Maybe some of you have written some of those letters. obviously we have to respond with those, and sometimes they're legitimate and sometimes they aren't. But when it does come to a place where complaints about a pastor, for instance, are pretty much verified, and so we know that there are some issues, and a supervisory response of some sort is started. What I've discovered after 6 years, and I'm a slow learner at some things, and so it did take me quite a while, but now when I have a conversation with a pastor that is in a supervisory, whether it's official or unofficial, and we've agreed to some things, I make sure that I write them down and send it in an email to them. Here's what I understand our agreement was from our conversation yesterday. If you have any additions or you didn't hear it that way or we need to have a conversation, let's be really clear so that next time we meet, we have something to go from for follow-up. So that's a best practice that I've learned from when you have several conversations with the same clergy over and over again, and you know you've asked them to do something before. So that's helpful to you all then at the Board of Ordained Ministry if it ever comes to you for action, because then you have a clear record of what has been asked and what the response has been. So hopefully that's a win-win for both of us.
Great. Any questions at the microphone? Anyone want to step up? Here's your chance. If not, we've got a card here, and Bishop Harvey, you spoke about at the district level, that's the key place right there. What are some best practices? What are some ways to really help that team?
I think, first of all, the presence of the superintendent and the DCOM. I mean, this is serious business, so you've got to be not just there, but you've got to be present to the situation. I think also your willingness to gracefully ask a candidate to continue their ministry as a layperson. I think you got to have the guts to do that. I think the other is, I know in one of the DCOMs I served, if you didn't have an A+ rating on your psychologicals, you didn't go through. That was the directive that we had. Actually, Gail Ford Smith was my superintendent when I was on that DCOM, and if they did not have an A+ rating, we did not move them through the process. So when you talk about gatekeepers or whatever we want to call those folks, but that's where I think the rubber really hits the road, is at the DCOM. The further they get down the road, the harder it is to turn back.
One of the issues that we have at DCOM lately that is a new issue because of circumstances in the world has to do with credit reports. And because a lot of people lost their homes in Las Vegas and Arizona, we had a huge housing crash. And so we actually have candidates coming through that have a foreclosure or a bankruptcy on their credit report because they were victim of the economic crunch. And so those have generated conversations that we hadn't had before. And so as a DCOM, I think that you need to be prepared for those kinds of things, and that might come before you as a Board of Ordained Ministry too, if somebody with a bankruptcy or that kind of thing comes before the board as an approved candidate from DCOM, hopefully there's an explanation with that. So there are some things that aren't so cut and dried as they used to be. And so that's one that has come before us that's fairly new in the last few years.
Right, and seminary debt and just educational debt is crushing. And I think probably early on we have to maybe provide some financial advice, some training, or some just reality. This is going to cost you, if you go through this process, it could cost you $100,000 or more, and it's very difficult. I went to a consultation on this, and it was said that the typical seminary graduate can handle about $30,000 of seminary debt upon graduation, and that's what they can handle. But most of our seminarians are graduating with a lot more than that. So that's going to be a really a key issue, is how we get them. And bankruptcy is actually not a solution there, because you can't get away from educational debt in bankruptcy. So
good. Here's an interesting one. How do you supervise not the troublemakers, but the good old clergy person?
Bishop? Yeah, I don't know.
I asked the superintendent.
Okay, I think what you may be naming is the person who is a good, okay clergy person, maybe came to seminary at a certain time with a certain kind of idealism, and then now they realize that that time has passed. And what do they do with them? Yeah, I've been trying to provide training. I think actually coaching is really an important thing. I do know of a case of one clergy person who was really kind of thought of as, frankly, quite lame, and there was no other word for him. But then, the district superintendent worked with him and said, why don't you go to some of these things? So he went to some of these consultations and some of these conferences, started reading books, and actually, he really took it seriously and was nurtured and helped, and he became actually one of the more successful pastors in our conference. So now, the thing about it is, the caveat to that is that he wanted to improve.
Yeah.
The problem is a lot of our pastors, they just, if they could get another job that would pay as much and pay their pension and health insurance, they'd do it in a heartbeat. We hesitate because I really am trying to find the answer. I don't know, maybe all of y'all know how to figure that out, but that's the hardest one for us in cabinet. One of the questions we ask is, okay, how old is this person? How far away is this person from retirement? Because we've got to figure out, well, what are we going to do? So I don't really have a good answer for that one.
I think that they're situational too. So we have some instances where I had two clergy that you would probably say are in that category, and both of them, for effectiveness issues, were part of a supervisory process. And so we provided the option for them for coaching, for psychological counseling, for spiritual direction, as well as conversations and training around becoming more effective in a world that they didn't enter in when they entered into ministry. And both of them pretty much the same process. One followed it, one internalized it, one did it, and they have a new appointment, and we have hopes that that person will be like you said, will be able to move forward. The other one jumped through the hoops, in other words, attended the sessions but didn't do anything with that, and he's no longer in ministry with us. And so, I think you offer what you can to help move somebody in a place of good leadership for vital ministry. Another option is we have some churches that are dying and have no desire not to die. And so that could be a great match for an appointment.
It's true.
I'm sort of the chaplain appointment, if you will.
True.
I will
Specialized ministry.
Specialized ministry, right? I will take care of this church until we both die, or one retires or whatever. I mean, that is an option that we talk about as a cabinet. If we have a pastor who just doesn't get ministry in the 21st century, we'll try to put them with a church that doesn't have any desire to be in ministry in the 21st century, and sort of play it by ear there. So, boards of ordained ministry credential those pastors. And so if you're on the board, I really want you to think, if you become a DS in the next 10 years and you have this person to appoint, are you going to be able to appoint them? I think that's a legitimate question.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the real key is the do no harm pastor. Pastor that shows up every day, does their thing. And then there is the pastor that doesn't show up every day, that never visits people. I mean, I think there's two different things here. And we've solved some of that by doing exactly what you said. We send them to a church where they will be fine doing no harm. But we've created through the Board of Ordained Ministry a program where we take ineffective pastors through a process. We're still working through that, and it's rigorous, and it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of supervision. So when we enter into these IPD processes, the superintendent has to be willing to supervise the process. And when, this is back to the other question, when you're supervising, when you've got 100 churches, and you've got this one that's taking 99% of your time, how do you manage that? So, but when you deal with ineffectiveness and you put somebody through a process, it takes time. It takes an incredible amount of time and commitment, and I hope commitment to the person for success on the other end. But I think that's something that the superintendents have to be well aware of when we go through that.
And one place where I tread very carefully with pastors, because it's like money, but I ask them, tell me about your spiritual disciplines. Tell me about what you're doing, to feed your soul. And usually they will say, well, nothing, not much, and I just have to say, let's start over and let's really start working on rebuilding your soul, and then hopefully that will rekindle a passion for them for ministry.
Question over there, go ahead.
In a denominational setting that's been in decline for some number of years, and based on some of the statistics that we've seen over the last few days, as much as 50% over the past several years, I'm wondering from a supervisory standpoint, how much of the responsibility for the decline of local churches we're assessing to individual pastors versus perhaps individual pastors losing faith, hope, that the church can be different. Zeal, losing that sense of zeal. That, if you brought them in and they had a sense of zeal, how did that die? Where did that go? Because it seems like a lot of the conversation around supervision is focused on trying to fix broken pastors, and I'm wondering how you fix broken pastors if the structure that they're working with is fundamentally broken.
Good question.
I go back to John Wesley and just the emphasis on discipleship, and one of the questions I ask churches every year is, how many of your congregation are in accountable discipleship groups or in practices, and especially how many of your leaders? Because I find that a lot of our leaders are not in accountable spiritual discipleship. So I kind of start with that, because I think part of it is you can send great pastors sometimes to it's to me seeds and soil, sometimes you can have great seed, but if the soil isn't good, it's not going to work. So kind of working on tilling the soil a little bit and say, okay, let's start learning here and go back to what John Wesley held so dear.
In a couple of appointments where we've sent one of those best, brightest kind of pastors, we sat down with the church and the SPR, the district superintendent, and set the expectations for what they expected in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Otherwise, the pastor would be terribly underappointed if they didn't move in this direction. So it was clear, so it was a two-way street. We were committed to the process, but we also expected the church to be committed to the process. And if they didn't reach this kind of benchmark, or we didn't see potential for reaching that benchmark at this juncture, we would move the pastor. And we just did. We just did do that, and gave them a good pastor. We just didn't, they had one of our best and brightest in this congregation, and we did move them. So I think that's, it's important that the church also recognizes the expectation. On the flip side, we had a church that 1 year ago was worshiping 20. And 1 year later, they're worshiping 120 with the pastoral change. So it was putting somebody in that church. It wasn't about the church. It might have been, but it was about that zeal, that passion, that leadership that pastor could offer. From 20 to 120 in 1 year. In 1 year. And when you ask him, what did you do? It's the stuff we all know you're supposed to do. He walked the streets. He showed up at the football game. They offered snow cones to kids after school in the summer, or after school. And they did what pastors are supposed to do, from 20 to 120. So I think when the church knows what the expectation is, I think that's important as well. Just as I said, expectation of what you expect of the pastor.
I think that as cabinets, we're pretty aware of the dysfunctional churches. in our annual conference and in our districts. And I've never seen us have expectations that a pastor wouldn't be brought to a supervisory place when it's the church's fault. And so conversations happen with the pastor and the church long before we would ever declare that an ineffectiveness issue. It could be a church dysfunction issue, and then we would do an assessment of the local church and offer to walk alongside them if they're willing to do what it takes to turn around the church. And that takes energy and the vote of the church council and a lot of hard work on the part of the superintendent and the congregational developer and whatever structure you have in your annual conference to make that happen. But if we've got a good pastor who can turn around a church and a church that's willing, then we will walk alongside them and try to help make that happen.
Well, I mean, that's what missional appointment making is all about, is trying to create that match.
Right.
One final question before we begin to wrap up, and it is this. What's the one thing you'd suggest that the people in this room do to further develop their role of supervision? The one thing.
For me, it would be building relationships. I was joking with some of my CalPAC friends here about my after-hours supervisory process. And so a lot of times it's, are you having lunch or meeting at annual conference after the sessions are all over and you get together with a group and just have a conversation. And while that's not supervision per se, it's relationship building, so that when a pastor or a congregational member or a lay leader has an issue, they know me enough to be able to say, I have an issue, and we can talk it through. If I am perceived as, the district superintendent who really doesn't have a clue about anything because they don't know who I am and what my passions are and what my hopes are for their local church, they're probably not going to come to me. So I'd say build relationships with the people for whom you have responsibility.
I ditto that, but I'd also say clarification of expectation.
I would first say, go back to John Wesley, and then after that, I would say, for boards of ordained ministries, I think it's really important for them within themselves and with the cabinet and with the orders to build relationships within themselves and also with each other. Because I have noticed that the decisions that boards of ordained ministries tend to make, and cabinets too, a lot of it depends on the relationships that are made between themselves, and therefore somehow the whole process, appointive and ordained ministry process, seems to go better.
Right, because that's trust.
Because that's
so
trust.
If you trust the people with whom you work and you have a disagreement, you know that you can talk it through and come out with a good solution. If you don't trust each other, that's when we get those firewalls that are really hard to break down.
Right.
That's great.
And my relationship with the board chair and the executive committee is also that relationship, and you talk about clarity of expectation. When we get off script, one of us is pretty clear. They'll say, now Bishop, do you really want to do that? You said this, so, and I can say the same to them. So it is that we're working on this to create effective pastors and vital congregations at the end of this day, and a denomination that sees a new day for a long time.
Great. Well, I want to thank our three panelists for their robust discussion today. I do want to thank you, and I know I stand between you and lunch, but we do have an announcement or two. Meg, if you'd come to the front. Oh, there you go.